Hey friends, welcome back. We're going to keep reading Leon and the Spitting Image by Alan Kurtzwell. Remember, I don't own the copyright to this book. We're just reading it out loud together for educational purposes. And last time we read, Leon has found out his fourth grade teacher is super strict and sewing obsessed, which is not good for him. And he lost a game of dodgeball to his arch nemesis, Lumpkin. So he had a pretty bad first day of school. So we're going to pick back up with chapter 5, The Stitches of Virtue. Miss Hagmaier strode into class on the second day of school, just as the bell finished ringing. She looked pretty much the same as she had the day before. Black cape, black dress, black lace-up boots, liver-colored pantyhose covering her skinny legs. There was, however, one minor costume change. P.W. was the first to spot it. "Psst, check out the glass eyes," he whispered to Leon, who in turn gave Lily Matisse a nudge. The yellow eyes had been swapped for a snow-white pair that had silver flecks surrounding their slit-shaped pupils. Miss Hagmaier called the class to order with a wave of her instructional needle. After everyone was seated, she handed out Medieval Readers and said, "Let the apprenticeship begin. Turn to page 16 and review the section titled Medieval Ethics." There was a ruffle of pages and then silence. As the class worked its way through the assigned reading, Miss Hagmaier unlocked her cabinet and removed a few supplies she lined up on her desk. 5 minutes later, she said, "Okay, eyes up, readers down. Who can name one of the 7 deadly sins that ruled moral life in the Middle Ages?" Antoinette promptly raised her hand. The metal pointer pointed. "Yes, Miss Breed." "Envy?" "That's one," said Miss Hagmaier. "Who can name another?" "Murder!" Henry Lumpkin shouted. "Don't yell, Mr. Lumpkin, and no, murder is not a deadly sin." "Greed?" said P.W. "Yes, greed is good. What about you, Mr. Ziesel?" Before Leon could respond, Henry Lumpkin caused another ruckus, this time by releasing a bodily noise that caused titters to spread throughout the room. "Flatulence is not a deadly sin either," Miss Hagmaier scolded. When she realized her word choice had confused some students, she went to the blackboard and wrote, "Flatulence equals farting." This is the term well-mannered medieval folk would have used when breaking wind. Memorize it. It will be on your next vocabulary test. Thomas Warchowski bent over and whispered to Leon, "She's wrong about farts not being deadly. If she ever ate my mom's Brussels sprouts, she'd know those suckers can kill." The radar beacons hidden under Miss Hagmaier's possibly fake hair registered the remark. "That's enough out of you, Miss Warchowski. Mr. Warchowski, tell your mother to sprinkle some dill on her Brussels sprouts if she wishes to reduce their gassy stink. That is what the monks used to do. Now, can we get back to business? Mr. Ziesel, you were about to name another deadly sin." "Anger," said Leon. "Good," said Miss Hagmaier. "What sins are left?" "Gluttony," said Lily Matisse. "Right. Can you name another?" "Pride?" "Correct. And what is pride?" "Isn't it like boasting?" "Not like boasting, Miss Jaspro. It is boasting. Who can give me an example of pride?" Antoinette raised her hand. "Go ahead, Miss Breed." "Last year for the 3rd grade Nimble Fingers craft fair, I made the best potholders. Nanny brought me this real cashmere and I—" "That's fine," Miss Hagmaier said tepidly. "Though let me assure you, cashmere potholders will not be made in my class." What a relief, Leon told himself. Miss Hagmaier looked at her watch and said, "Right, we have 2 remaining sins. Anyone?" "Lust," said P.W., giggling. "Correct. That leaves one more." Miss Hagmaier looked around the room. When no one could name the last of the 7 deadly sins, she said, "Sloth. The final sin is sloth, also known as laziness. It is the one sin this master will never tolerate." Miss Hagmaier put down her pointer and reached for a piece of cloth. "Now, let's move on to the 7 heavenly virtues." "But that's not in the reader," whined Antoinette. "True, which is why I'm passing around this medieval sampler." Leon's calm disappeared the instant the cloth arrived at his desk. It looked like this. Heavenly stitches of virtue. 1. Running stitch. 2. Basting stitch. 3. Chain stitch. 4. Hemming stitch. 5. Back stitch. 6. Overcast stitch. 7. Satin stitch. Ambushed! What kind of teacher thinks of sewing as heavenly? Leon wondered. He felt the deadly sin of an anger surge through him as the implications of the sampler sank in. "Can anyone tell me what a stitch is?" Miss Hagmaier asked the class. Thomas, still feeling bold, whispered to Leon, "A sharp pain in the—" "Mr. Warchowski, this is your 2nd warning. One more and you'll find yourself sitting in Principal Birdwhistle's office." Thomas bowed his head. A trip to the birdcage was not to be taken lightly. Miss Hagmaier scanned the desk for further signs of rebellion. Finding none, she answered her own question. "A stitch is a bond, a connection, an action that unites. In the Middle Ages there were many kinds of stitches, but the 7 listed on this sampler are the ones that you must learn." She picked up a giant wooden spool she had retrieved from the cabinet. For demonstration purposes, I will be using my instructional needle, this yarn, and a specialized pair of yarn snips. All of you, of course, will be given regular needles and thread. Leon stared at the spool. It was wrapped with thick orange yarn, the color of Henry Lumpkin's hair. Now, please pay attention, said Miss Hagmaier. We will begin with the basics. Step 1, measure an arm's length of thread. Step 2, cut thread. Please take note of the verb cut. I don't want to see any thread biting, which is a disgusting habit and entirely unacceptable. So far, so good, Leon said to himself. He felt confident he could measure and cut. Step 3, said Miss Hagmaier. With a firm, decisive poke, guide the thread through the eye of the needle. That's when Leon started to get antsy. Notice how I pull down on my yarn once it is threaded. Doing so avoids slipping. Step 4, knot the longer end of the thread. For those of you who are a little clumsy, Miss Hagmaier stopped mid-sentence. For those of you whose fine motor skills need some work, tie the two ends of the thread together. Leon seethed. He knew what she had almost said. Why didn't she just stick a big fat Klutzo sticker on his forehead? With the threading portion of the exercise complete, Miss Hagmaier called her students to the front of the room, individually by last name. She presented each with a standard sewing needle, a spool of thread, and a handout that reproduced the stitches on her sampler. She also had everyone choose a piece of cloth from a colorful pile of scraps. By the time she said Ziesel, only one scrap remained, and it was pink. For the rest of the period, the class threaded and stitched, consulting the sampler while Miss Hagmaier moved between the desks like a shuttle of a loom. Tighten up that back stitch, Miss Breed. Mr. Lumpkin, remove that needle from your thumb this instant. Mr. Barchkowski, watch the way you pull on the thread. You're making the cloth pucker. Leon kept his head down, hoping to avoid notice. Mr. Ziesel, haven't you threaded your needle yet? What do you think? Leon snarled back, if only in his thoughts. He gave a helpless shrug. Look around, Miss Hagmaier said. Most of the class has finished practicing their stitches. You have not started. Leon surveyed the room. Lily Matisse rolled her eyes. P.W. made a face suggesting their teacher was demented. What do you propose to do, Mr. Ziesel? I don't know, Leon mumbled. Perhaps you might develop your skills by completing the assignment at home. Leon nodded, only too happy to give needlework a rest. Miss Hagmaier walked over to the supply cabinet. A place for everything and everything in its place, she said as she opened the doors. After hooking the padlock onto one of the door handles, she returned with a wooden spool and yarn snips, swiftly shutting the cabinet before Leon could get a peek inside. But as she was walking back to her desk, the weight of the lock on the handle caused one of the doors to swing open, providing Leon a view of the cabinet's interior. And what a view it was! The top part of the cabinet was fitted with a piece of pegboard, from which hung dozens and dozens of tools, each labeled and outlined in black marker. Leon spotted the yarn snips Miss Hagmaier had just used, along with twine nips, snappers, snaplers, zigzaggers, scallopers, pinchers, pinking shears, and slishers. And those were just the cutting tools. Directly below the pegboard, there were racks of thread displaying a rainbow of colors, but it was the drawers dominating the lowest portion of the cabinet that attracted Leon most. One said claws, another said fingers, a third said flippers and fins. There was a drawer marked elephant ears Indian, and another, which was slightly larger, marked elephant ears African. Noses of various kinds, beaks, bills, trunks, snouts filled one row of drawers. Eyeballs filled another two. There were drawers for smiles, grimaces, and smirks, drawers for teeth and tongues, freckles and fangs. A section devoted to the body parts of mythical creatures included a compartment reserved for unicorn horns. All the drawers were marked, with one exception. An especially large compartment lacked a masking tape label. Curiosity gnawed at Leon. He wanted to know what the unlabeled drawer contained, but resisted the impulse to sneak a peek. The unpleasant consequences of his last unauthorized investigation of his mother's desk were still fresh in his mind. He distracted himself by glancing about the room. All his classmates were focused on Miss Hagmaier, who was busily writing numbers on the blackboard and droning on about bringing down the 6. Leon had no interest whatsoever in bringing down the 6, so while Miss Hagmaier generated remainders and dividends, he reached over and wrapped his fingers around the knob of the unidentified drawer. He gave the knob a gentle tug and peered inside. At first, Leon couldn't figure out what he was looking at. Once he had, he reared his head back slightly. The contents of the drawer confused him, and embarrassed him, and grossed him out. The dull gray tangle wasn't as disgusting or fascinating as, say, teacher's spit, but it came pretty close. Mr. Ziesel, Miss Hagmaier said. Still puzzling over his discovery, Leon failed to hear his name. Mr. Ziesel, Miss Hagmaier repeated more forcefully. Huh? Get your nose out of my pantyhose! It took a moment for the command to register. When it did, Leon felt the blood rushing to his head. The whole class went berserk, laughing and hooting as he sank into his chair. "Silence!" Miss Hagmaier shouted. She marched over to the cabinet. "Next time, I'll know better than to leave this open." She padlocked the doors and turned to Leon. "Students who can't thread needles shouldn't poke through their teachers' things, should they, Mr. Cecil?" "No, Miss Hagmaier," Leon said abjectly. "They should listen to their teachers, should they not?" she further chided. "Sorry," said Leon. He felt dangerously close to tears. "Apology accepted. Provisionally. However, in the future, I expect you to stay out of my drawers unless authorized. As it is, you have your hands full, what with stitching practice and tonight's assignment." "What assignment?" Leon asked. Miss Hagmaier released an irritated snort. "As I explained while you were rifling through my hose, I expect everyone to bring in a piece of cloth." "What kind of cloth?" Miss Hagmaier shook her head in despair. "I answered that question too, Mr. Cecil. It doesn't make the slightest difference what kind. Bring in a dish towel, bring in some upholstery fabric, bring in a piece of old bedsheet for all I care. Just so long as it's roughly the size of your desktop. And I'll answer the next question before you ask it," she added. "You will need the cloth for your first sewing project of the year." And that is where we're going to leave it for today. So it seems like Leon's second day of school is not going any better than his first day of school did. So we will find out what happens next tomorrow, and I will see you guys then. Bye.